All right, so let's get started. So my name is Nitij. I am a recent, I guess not so recent, it's been 8 months, grad from St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota. I graduated last May. I took the MCAT in June of last year. And I'm currently working at the National Institutes of Health as a postbac for 2 years. So I'm in like month 5 of my 2-ish years. So, all right. So this presentation is going to be based on a couple of things. It's going to be based on advice that I personally have for the MCAT and also responses to some of the questions that y'all posed in our survey. And so how this is going to work is I'm going to talk. If anybody has any questions, you're free to put it in the chat or unmute yourself and ask. So I don't mind being interrupted if you have a question in the moment. And I believe we have a couple of other mentors in the chat that are also going to be monitoring in case I miss anything. So let's get started. Okay, so general advice. Okay, so the first thing you have to do is knowing where you're starting when you're studying for the MCAT. And so you're not gonna practically be able to review every single thing that could be on the MCAT. And so a diagnostic test will tell you a lot about your test taking skills, where you are in terms of content, confidence, stamina, a lot of different things. And you should take it with testing conditions to get as good a result as you can that will reflect your actual ability. And I would recommend for this the AAMC sample test. Keep track of your mistakes. So from the very beginning, the day after I took the diagnostic test, all the way until the day I took the exam, I kept an F-up list of mistakes where I documented every single thing that I struggled with or didn't know, whether that was in practice questions or practice tests, or in my general review. For example, like if I missed a question on Erickson's stages, I would write that down. If I made a dumb mistake and like missed something related to axis labels, or I misread axis labels, I might say, keep axis labels in mind, just so you don't mess that up next time. Or if there's a question on types of memory, I might say, okay, write down implicit versus explicit memory. And that way you have a complete record of any piece of information or common mistake that you can then keep in mind as you review and practice. And you automatically start building a study guide that is specific to you and what you need to work on. And so over the course of my 4 or 5 months of studying, my list grew to many pages of various things on this list. And then I could just go down the list every week, knock out a bunch of terms, make sure I knew them really well. And that way I was able to patch up all the cracks in my understanding. Okay, this is a particular thing that I learned mainly from tutoring as well as taking the exam myself, that that you want to pay for practice, not for content. And so content is actually way easier to find for free. Khan Academy, the organic chemistry tutor, Jack Weston, other types of online stuff, and just like the class material that you've taken if you still have class notes or class lectures or PowerPoints. And given that everything's so expensive, you should be investing the bulk of or all of the money you plan to spend for the MCAT, for MCAT prep on practice exams and question banks, or one-on-one tutoring if you're paying for tutoring, because those things are things you can't get for free, at least in any appreciable supply. So what I found was that my money was best spent buying AAMC materials and UWorld materials. So I'll get to my preferences and third-party resources in a little bit. But I think that as far as bang for your buck, you're going to want to spend money on practice and not content. Okay, beware of some third-party materials. So some third-party materials can get a little aggressive as far as how deep they're going to go in content. So Kaplan will actually dig into like some like topics that you might see as a first-year medical student, or like organic chemistry topics that would never actually show up on the actual MCAT. And so this is kind of based on the whole idea that if they deflate your score enough and make you think that you have a lot of content that you don't know, then you'll buy more stuff. You might pay for their course. And so that's why I'm a little suspicious of them. Kaplan and Princeton Review tend to do that. That doesn't mean they're not good practice materials sometimes. It's just that you have to kind of take it with a grain of salt whenever you measure yourself up against those materials. So some third-party exams are good for practice, like getting used to the feel of the exam and building up your stamina. And some are more better for diagnostic, like seeing where you actually are in terms of readiness. And those that I would say AMC and UWorld are the best. What content books did you end up using? So I actually earlier on in college, I had a friend who was selling like a whole bunch of used MCAT books, and so I ended up getting a Kaplan set, and I barely touched it, and so I sold it to somebody else who was going to get more out of it after I took the exam. So I personally thought that as far as if you're trying to review content, you might want to think twice before getting a book, just because they're so expensive. And if you are able to figure out what topics you actually want to go over, then you should think, as far as learning content, you should think about looking at those free resources. Did you have a strong understanding of the science content from your prereq? So I would say I did. And one of the things that I discovered, PPR is Princeton Review. So for my prereqs, one thing I did that in retrospect worked out really well for me is I took classes and then I TA'd them. So during my like junior and senior years, I TA'd organic chemistry and cell biology, and I also took biochemistry and physics. And so having taken or TA'd a class, all that stuff was really fresh, and so I was able to do really well just even starting out because of that. And so that's something that I would recommend if for any of you younger students who have maybe a semester or two before you take the MCAT, TAing a class that you've taken that you might want to review again, that's really, really helpful. What school did I go to? I went to St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota. It's a small liberal arts school of about 3,000. Yes, and so in general, I'm not trying to like completely like take a dig at Kaplan and Princeton Review. I just think that it's, you have to know what you're getting into. Some people benefit from that kind of practice, but some people don't. MCAT course or self-study. I'll get to that in a few minutes. Okay, and then consistency is always better than intensity. Pretty much, I mean, I know very few people that can actually cram for this exam, properly cram like 1 or 2 months. I personally think that you need minimum 3 months and potentially a little bit longer if you work or also take classes, just because like it takes a while to get into the swing of like getting your brain wired for this stuff. So you have to do a lot of questions, you have to do a lot of practice, you have to give yourself time to adjust to the format, get yourself thinking in that particular way. And I really think that it takes a while to get used to it and really feel confident in running with this this format and just how long it is. So consistency over time is going to be really, really important. Okay, during the test, some basic advice. So read the question to yourself. This is something that I do a lot, like this mistake I usually make is I glance at the question and then just kind of decide that like just be like, oh, it's asking this, and then I try to answer it, and then it's then when I get it wrong and I go back and then I like, oh, they were asking a totally different question than I was mentally reading. So what I did after that and during the exam is I would go word by word and read the question, and so I'd force myself to actually process what it said. I wouldn't take like a whole minute doing this, but I would read it word by word to make sure that I didn't miss any details in the question. Do you recommend taking during the summer? And then, so I'm assuming you mean studying during the summer and taking it right after the summer. I think there's no necessarily right way or right time to take it. I think it's all about just the time, the amount of time you put in and like what courses you've taken. So I think that you can take it pretty much any time, as long as it's far enough before your actual application. But I don't think there's necessarily a benefit to taking it at one time of the year versus another. Also, the person who sent me that question, could you adjust your settings so that you ask the question to the whole group so everybody can see and somebody can tell me if I miss one of your questions? Okay, thanks. Okay. So another thing, leave your baggage at the door. So most of the time. So a lot of passages will teach you something. They'll go in depth about a particular pathway or molecule or reaction that you didn't know about before. And sometimes you might run into something you've studied before through research or class. There's actually a passage in the AAMC question bank about a single-celled ciliate called Tetrahymena thermophila, and about the mating genetic like dynamics of mating. And what's interesting is that it's actually a pretty complicated process. The session is being recorded. Okay, so it's a tetrahymena, a pretty complicated process. The mating is kind of confusing. Fortunately for me, tetrahymena mating is what I spent like 3 years at St. Olaf researching. And so that you're just going to have some times when you know a lot about the thing that's being talked about in the passage, and that gives you an advantage just based on your experience. But you want to make sure you base your answers primarily on what the passage says, and then secondarily on your background knowledge, because sometimes a lot of the times these questions will trick you into taking shortcuts and making assumptions that are not supported by the passage, even if they're true. And therefore you have to be very careful with what you're assuming and what you're bringing, what background you're bringing. But in some situations that can be an asset. So you kind of have to be careful with applying background knowledge. It can be when there's a passage, it can be helpful, but it can also be a blind spot. Okay, don't assume you don't know the answer. So I have worked with a bunch of students, and one of the biggest things that students do, especially when they're intimidated by the MCAT, is they see a passage and they do questions, but they have already decided that they don't know the answer. And so they miss questions that they definitely knew the answer to, because we go back and they're like, oh, that was easy. And so when you're practicing, go in assuming that you either know how to answer it or you will know how to answer it once you learn the thing that you need to learn. And so that way you're not like negotiating against yourself before you even read the question. So overall, the questions, the passage's power is in its ability to psych you out from being able to actually address the question, but you have to practice not letting it do that. Yeah, and as Sim says, process of elimination can be really helpful. I'm going to get into how to deal with being stuck on the next slide, I think. Yes. Okay. So when you have a passage and you feel super lost, first thing I would say is skip it and come back to it. You can always come back to it. There's no penalty for that. If you're still lost and you come back to it, see if there are any questions from that passage that you can answer without understanding the entire passage too well. there's always some of those questions that focuses on a very specific part of the passage, and you can sometimes get some gimmies just from understanding some basic stuff about the passage. And then for what remains, try to break down the passage, figure out what you do understand, and this takes practice. You can learn how to use context clues to kind of slowly pick apart the passage to figure out what the basic gist of it is for you to answer those remaining questions. And like Sim said, you can combine process of elimination with these tactics. Okay, technical tips. This is a big one that mistake that I see made all the time, myself included. The units are really important, chemistry and physics especially. If they're giving you something in milligrams, but then the answer is going to be in like grams per centimeter cubed, you have to do that math. Meters squared versus meters cubed, units canceling out, especially when you're doing like dimensional analysis where you're converting from like grams to moles to molecules. It's really important that you pay attention to that, and so you don't do the entire problem and then mess up the units and therefore get it wrong, because that's just a really shitty feeling. Okay. Easy problems wrapped in hard problems. So there's actually a lot of questions are easy problems wrapped in hard problems. And so there's actually, I was tutoring a student last week, and we were going over a question, and he was really struggling with it. But then when he realized that the entire question was just using a mass in the passage and dividing it by a volume also provided in the passage to get density, it took him like 15 seconds. And so a lot of the time you'll find that some of these questions that look really galling are actually very simple if they're just rephrased in a way that makes sense, which you have to kind of do for yourself. Figure out like what is at the very core of the question, what is it asking you to do? Okay, this is a big one that's going to come in handy for bio and biochem. Okay, so necessary and sufficient. You might have seen this in biochemistry or cell biology. So these are used to describe cause and effect relationships. So let's look at these two situations. If A is necessary for B to occur, that means if you take A away, B doesn't occur. So A is the only cause of B. If it's not there, B doesn't happen. Now, if A is sufficient for B to occur, that means that if you add A, introduce A and nothing else, B does occur. So A always causes B. Okay, let's look at a couple of examples. Okay, Tay-Sachs disease. A particular gene mutation is the only cause of and always causes Tay-Sachs disease. So let's look at necessary. No one without the mutation gets the disease. So you need the mutation to get the disease. And if you have the mutation, you will definitely get the disease. So it's necessary and sufficient. Now let's look at HIV and AIDS. Being infected by HIV is the only cause of AIDS. So if you're uninfected, you can't get AIDS. Therefore, HIV is necessary. But you can get infected by HIV, but you might not get AIDS. So an HIV infection is not sufficient for AIDS. The slightly grislier example next. Decapitation is not the only cause of death, but it pretty much always causes death. So not all deaths are caused by decapitation. Sufficient means that if you add it, the effect happens. The effect always happens. Yeah, so just because somebody died doesn't mean they were decapitated. So decapitation is not necessary for death to occur, but person who is decapitated is probably dead. So the decapitation is sufficient to cause death. Now, some things are neither necessary nor sufficient for a particular effect. So a number being odd is neither necessary nor sufficient for the number being a multiple of 5. So if a number isn't odd, it can still be a multiple of 5. So being odd isn't necessary for being a multiple of 5. And a number can be odd, but still not be a multiple of 5. So it's not sufficient for it either. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, we can always come back to this if there are any further questions about it that come up later. Okay, drawing conclusions. So this is a thing that the MCAT loves to do, is they will get you to assign cause and effect and try to overreach with your conclusions, even if it's missing a key piece of evidence. So it'll often do this, like, what conclusion can you draw from this result? And it'll give you a bunch of them, and you have to decide which one you can safely say without making any unfounded assumptions. And that takes practice, and so that's the thing that you should be considering as you start doing your practice. You will encounter these questions, and you should know when you reach them that that's something that you need to pay attention to. And unless you've read a ton of papers, and even if you've read a ton of papers, it still requires a lot of practice. But for those of you on the younger side, even if you're not necessarily super interested in research, as a career, getting a research experience or two can be really helpful in understanding how to take the MCAT. That's something that I didn't realize going in, but luckily I had the research experience, because it's basically they're asking you to how to interpret science, and that is something you can only learn through. That is something that the best way to learn it is through being on a research project and trying to understand how that works. Okay. Before we get to your questions, do you have any questions about the advice that we've talked about so far? Okay. All right. The question is how to get into a research project. That's a great question. I can get into that briefly. Or I can I'll get to that at the end. Okay. Content studying. Okay. What are some tips for doing math on the MCAT? And so one thing that I learned through my practice is that they will honestly go out of their way to make computations easy for you, because you're not allowed to use a calculator. And so that is actually kind of a blessing, because they're not going to make you do anything that confusing or elaborate. So being able to do math by estimation and heuristics basically meaning like a method that's not perfect, but does the trick, that is a skill that can be practiced, and it's something that you need to get in the habit of trying to figure math out without a calculator. So I would say when you're practicing, never ever use a calculator, because you're not going to get it on the MCAT, and it's designed to be done in your head or via estimations on paper. There's also tons of tricks for doing more complicated math without a calculator, like translating pH back and forth from hydronium ion concentration. Many of these can be found on Reddit and online. We actually did a session on math tricks on the MCAT. That information we'll send you in our follow-up email. Okay, how do you study for a long time without forgetting info from the beginning? So in general, studies have shown that a cycle of learning, forgetting, remembering, and sometimes even forgetting again and remembering again can lead to strong memories. So the number one thing I would say is create your own Anki study guide for terms. Don't use somebody else's, because you remember creating the cards and then studying the cards and then reviewing the ones you got wrong or didn't do as well on later. And that cyclical pattern cements the memory for you. Do you use any quick sheet or cheat sheet? I mean, I did keep track of some things that I wanted to go over more frequently. So like if there's a particular formula or something I didn't know, I would kind of keep it in a running document that I had of stuff I needed to come back to frequently to remember. I'd also put it in my flashcards. Cyclical studying. So when you're starting out with something, you do it maybe 1 or 2 times a day. Then as you get used to it, you come back to it 1 or 2 times a week. Eventually 1 or 2 times a month, and then you might and that way you kind of keep it in your brain and you keep coming back to it. Quick sheet. The Kaplan quick sheets I think are pretty good. I don't know what mile done is, but I think the Kaplan quick sheets are a good resource. Naturally, some things drift away from your memory, and some things will stick. Okay, mile done. Okay, I don't know about it. You'll have to. Yeah, I've never heard of it. If anybody else has heard of it, feel free to comment on it. And so I'd say pay extra attention to things that drift away, but also don't go too far in that direction, and then the things you think you remember will actually become the things you forget because you go too hard on the things that you thought you were forgetting. It's a little bit confusing, but it's all about keeping things in balance. Pay attention to the things that you're good at, but also the things that you're bad at, and don't go too far in either direction. Okay, coursework, and this may be a source of a little bit of disagreement. So what I see as essential is intro chem, intro bio, cell bio, organic chemistry 1, organic chemistry 2, partially, because not the entire course is actually useful. Biochemistry, physics 1 and physics 2. Intro to psych, I really think is, I mean, you might have to take it anyway, just as part of your requirement. So I guess I would say that one I would lean more toward taking. Intro to Soc, anatomy, physiology, immunology, microbiology. Those are kind of nice to have. I don't think you even need anatomy and physiology. I didn't take it at all. I didn't even take intro to sociology. I did take intro to psych. I did take immunology, but people say that you need anatomy and physiology. You don't really need anatomy, physiology. Physics. Okay, so I would say MCAT-review.org is a really good website for an overall topic overview. The AAMC topics list is also really good. The MCAT review is a little more readable. Somebody raised their hand. Is that an accident, or do you have a question? Okay, I'm going to assume that was an accident. Okay. Yeah, that website right there. And also the Khan Academy videos, once you find topics that you want to go over again. Khan Academy's got really good physics videos. All right. Studying. Should I take a prep course? And this is going to be potentially a matter of some debate. There's some people that swear by these courses. I personally don't see the value of a course. It's very expensive and it's not always self-paced. Sometimes it is, but not always. But personally, I think you could get a lot better value for your money if you hire a tutor, just because you'll just get more done per dollar that you're spending. And it's also going to be for you, and you can focus specifically on what you need, because you may not spend as much time on the cell cycle as glycolysis, and a course cannot help you necessarily dedicate that extra time or take time away from something you're already really good at. But that's just me. Some people can benefit from that kind of structure. But on the other hand, you can look at it as getting $2,000 to find a way to manage your own schedule. And then you can allocate that money however you want into other resources that you can actually get more use out of. How to recruit a study schedule or calendar? This is a very common and very big question. So it's kind of complicated, but I think the basic principles are that you need to be very cognizant of what you need and what you need to focus on. And so that can be topics, that can be strategies, that can be like focusing on a particular section. As an MCAT tutor. I mean, lots of people are MCAT tutors. So MCAT 101 offers free and discounted tutoring to students who need it. The issue with that is our team is kind of small, and so we have kind of a limited capacity. I also offer discounted tutoring on my own on the side. And so I mean, you can you can find them on like tutors.com or Wyzant or through word of mouth. Yeah, so there's lots of people who tutor for the MCAT, so not too hard to find. I would say, yeah, and so be okay with giving yourself extra time for things you need and less time for things you don't necessarily need to go over as much. Perfect. Thanks for the link, Sim. I found that creating an outline is better than creating a strict schedule, because then you can kind of speed up or slow down on certain things, take an extra day if you need more time to work on something, as you get better at figuring out what you're good at. Question bank. Finish all the questions in time. Do you mean like, are you taking timed exams, or are you saying finish the questions before?
I basically divide the total time with a number and then just split the practice bank in half. But I always have problem finishing them on time. I found it to be harder than the double ANC actual exam.
Which question bank?
Double ANC bank.
Oh, the AAMC bank. Yeah, I mean, I don't know much about, because I always did the AAMC question bank in random chunks, so I'm not really sure how well designed it is for timing. If you have the same kind of timing problems on your AAMC full length, that I would say maybe merit some attention to your speed.
How do you practice your speed?
How do you practice your speed? I would say you'd want to. It's hard. It's hard to practice something that's kind of abstract. I would say figure out how long you actually take. So are you like twice as slow as you need to be, or are you just like 1.5 times, or like 10%?
One third of the time.
Sorry?
To finish any 1/3 of the time to finish all of the problem.
Oh, like 1 1/3 of the time?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, that I would say. Let me think. I think it's one thing that I like is that I think on the AAMC it'll actually tell you how long you spend on each question, and so most people have particular patterns in how they use extra time. So like some people take too long to read the passage. Some people agonize over specific questions. Some people get stuck and don't move on to the next question. Like usually it's one of those things. And if you look back at your question history and test history, it can tell you that. And then, for example, if you take too long on a passage, set a timer on how long you're allowing yourself to read the passage. If you agonize too much, give yourself a time limit on how long you can spend thinking about a question before you move on or guess. Stuff like that.
That's very helpful advice. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, let's keep going. How do I balance other obligations, school or work, with studying? Now that is a difficult one, and I was fortunate to be able to take a reduced course load, drop out of my research lab, and stop TAing and focusing on studying. Setting aside time consistently is key. Ideally the same time each day, but depending on what your hours are, that can be variable. See if you can reduce your other commitments, but that's not always possible, so I understand that too. And make sure you give yourself enough downtime. So give yourself enough time to like take breaks, exercise, eat well, sleep well, so you don't burn out, because burnout is really easy to fall into, and it will destroy your test taking ability and your ability to practice. Okay, balancing content review and practice, also a common question. Standardized exams give me bad. Oh, yeah. I guarantee you're not the only one about the bad vibes. What do you mean by how bad is the MCAT? I'm gonna keep going, and I'll come back to your question when you elaborate a little bit. So typically different for everybody for content review and practice. Depends on what coursework you've taken. Depends on how your diagnostic went. I started studying right after taking all these courses and TAing these really necessary courses, and so that helped. Sometimes it's good to do some content review before you start practicing and creating your mistake list. And also remember, for each of you, not all content is going to be equal. You might spend a day doing something, or spend a week doing something, depending on how well you remember it and how well you understood it when you learned it. In terms of difficulty, I mean, it's a bear. It's not impossible, but if you're well prepared, it is difficult, but not impossible. If you are not well prepared, it is very challenging. So the key is to be well prepared, and then it'll be just difficult and not terrible. Well, I wish I could give you a better response, but it's hard to put a rose on a 7.5-hour test. If you're not taking all these prereqs, which wouldn't be too bad. Depends on which ones you're talking about. I mean, to do well, I would say you need every single one on the left. Physics, definitely. Biochem, extra, definitely. Organic, definitely. Cell bio is not as essential as biochem, but cell bio will really help. Physics and biochem are pretty much non-negotiable. I found that psych and social were really easy. Maybe it's 7 hours. Maybe I'm miscounting. It's a long ass time. Somebody, you can correct me on that if I'm a little bit off, but it's 7 something like that. Yeah, but it's not. I mean, that's with breaks. You got a lunch break, but it's a giant pain in the ass, and we all acknowledge that. Okay, so somebody asked me a little while ago. Not taken. Okay, I got that. Okay, all right. When should I take the MCAT relative to when I apply to med school? Okay, so the MCAT's good for about 3 years. You have a few options, but the latest you should take it is mid-May of the year you're applying. So if you're going to begin applying in June, the latest you want to take it is mid-May of that same year. You can always take it earlier because it's good for 3 years. Like I took it last June, but I'm not even applying until this summer. How often should I take practice tests? So some people will say to save all the AAMC tests until the last month or two. I think this is an incorrect strategy. I think you should take the diagnostic at the very beginning and then spread out your AAMCs throughout your study schedule. That way you get a periodic assessment based on the actual metrics of the exam. So like if you're doing 4 months, 1 in month 2, 1 in month 3, and 2 in month 4. That way you're intensifying a little bit. And then if you want more practice, you can intersperse your third-party full length with the AAMCs. So that way you get more practice for stamina, but you have to be careful that sometimes those questions aren't representative of what you're going to get, and so that can be a little bit challenging. One thing that's kind of interesting is that having gone through so many practice questions and so many practice tests and the actual MCAT, I could probably look at a given practice question and tell you whether I think it's going to be on the MCAT or not. Whether I'm right might be up for debate, but I feel pretty confident about whether I can tell that just from seeing so many of them. Okay, taking notes or highlighting in your books. I don't really have a strong opinion about this. I think it's pretty much whatever works for you. Depending on whether you're planning on reselling books, that might factor into what you're planning. You can always use pencil and erase. You can always use those little sticky notes. Long-term advice. Fred, I got a couple of questions about what, have you ever seen any of the practice questions you went up on the MCAT word for word? No, I have not. Yeah, they're too clever for that. But what I always say is that there's a finite number of things they can test you on, and so if you see enough things when you're practicing, they can't surprise you, at least not that much. Which is why I recommend like AMC and New World, because that's like thousands of practice questions, all of which are pretty good. Okay, so freshman, undergraduate, to start prepping. So my number one piece of advice is just calm down. Unless you're planning on flying through undergrad and just going absolutely hard, which I would not recommend, and most people wouldn't recommend, because med schools don't really like admitting people who are super young. That isn't a rule, it's just a trend. Most of the relevant coursework is going to be ahead of you, and then you only really need at most 6 months for your dedicated MCAT studying. I would say no more than 6 months, because then you can burn out and not use your time as well. The best thing you can do as a first year is pay attention to your classes. Really invest in your classes, study well, come back to material. Don't cram for exams, because if you cram for exams, that stuff's not going to stick after the semester's over. You want to, if you practice good study habits during your first couple of years in college, you're actually setting up yourself well to remember things for the MCAT. So the courses will be you'll get a recording of this whole thing, so you will have access to that list. What you'd recommend start preparing? It all depends on what your plans are after, so I'll get to that too. Okay, gap year. That's going to answer your question. So, okay, if you do want a gap year, it depends on how many you want and what coursework you'll have finished. So I took physics and biochem senior year because I studied abroad junior year, and so that's just how my schedule worked out. So I waited until May of my senior year, and that worked out because I wanted to take 2 gap years, and so my score will be good when I apply in about 6 months. If you don't take a gap year, you will need to take the MCAT at the latest in May if you're junior year, and then you'd want to start studying 6 or less months beforehand. You can also take it at another time junior year, but if you take it as late as possible, you're more likely to have your courses, all the courses that you need under your belt. Okay, resources. Is it more beneficial to buy or rent the books? Honestly, I mean, I've mentioned this before. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of the books in general, because I don't think that content is something you should pay for. If you can rent the books, I think it makes more sense than buying. If you do buy, then make sure to resell, because it'll help future test takers. They don't have to pay full price, and you'll get some money back. Somebody asked about 2015 books. I think that might be a little bit too far back. Anybody else has an opinion on this, feel free to share. I feel like you'd want to get in the last few years. Also, if you buy it new, you can always sell it back at like 70 or 80% of cost if it's very lightly used. Yeah, there probably is a comparison guide on MCAT Reddit. Yeah. Okay. Low budget. All right. So this is a question that we got a lot. So free resources, like I said, are way more common than you think. If I had to rank the paid resources, I'd say AMC at the top, because that's the real deal. UWorld, which I personally believe is one of the biggest reasons why I did really well in the MCAT. I went through almost every single question. UWorld is exhaustive. If it's like anything that could possibly appear on the MCAT is in the UWorld question set. It's 2,000 questions. It's a little on the pricey side. And it's a subscription that you have to get, but it's really, really worth it. Next step, Exam Crackers Berkeley Review. I didn't really use it, so I don't really have a first-hand opinion on it. Princeton Review and Kaplan. I used Kaplan for a bit, and then I kind of got bored of it. People who've used the other third-party stuff, feel free to comment if you have experience with it. I sometimes don't like TPR and Kaplan because, like I said, they sometimes design their stuff to scare you into buying more stuff. So keep that in mind. Free resources. AAMC topics list, that's on the AAMC website. Khan Academy for passages, practice, content. Jack Weston has daily CARS passages. That one's a little bit hit or miss, but it's useful to just get in the habit of understanding how the CARS passage works. MCAT-review.org, really good for overall content review. There is a 300-page document on Reddit based on the Khan Academy playlists for Psych and Soc. And having only taken Intro Psych, I used that document over the course of 5 months and ended up with a 132 in Psych. So that document really does have everything you need to know. Okay, one-on-one free mentoring. Okay, so MCAT 101, as MCAT 101, we have a program for this, but our capacity is limited. So there is some limitations to that, but we are looking for mentors to join our team. So once you've taken the exam, if you're interested in paying it forward and helping out, we would love the extra help. Khan Academy has not removed it yet. It is, I think they just stopped maintaining it, and it will be gone in September, but I think Jack Weston is going to be taking all that content on. I'm not 100% sure. Yeah, there might be an Anki for it. I would say if you give yourself enough time, make your own Anki. I had an Anki that had like 600 cards on it, but it took me like 3 months to make. But because I made it myself, I remembered it a lot better. So in general, I would say making your own Anki deck is far better than using somebody else's because they made it for them. And you might want to make some changes in phrasing or what's included, what's not included, what's more in depth, what's less in depth, based on what you need. Retaking. Okay. Should I plan to take the MCAT more than once? I would say no. That being said, if you receive your score and feel like you can do better, there's absolutely nothing wrong with retaking it. But as you're studying, you should only plan to take it once. Now, some people are like, they're starting studying in January, and they're like, I'm going to take it in March so I can retake it if I need to. But that strategy is like self-defeating because now you're losing time that you could be spending studying for your one attempt by taking it early, when instead you could just put your best foot forward on one attempt. Might you need to retake it after that? Maybe, but that way you're not like crunching yourself into shorter amounts of time just because you think you might have to retake it. So the strategy going in is assume that you're only going to take it once. All right, well, that's the $1 million question, how important it is to do research, internships, and volunteer work. Important, I would say. I mean, it's a very hard question because they never tell you, and everyone is mostly guessing. Can it make or break your acceptance? Also, it depends because are you talking about like not having it at all or having a little bit of it? Because some people build their entire application on service and the research experiences are minimal, and that works. Some people do not that much service, but they do a ton of research and they want to take a more academic focus. That works. It's really about what you care about and constructing your profile, your application, and your story around what you care about. Also a $1 million question, how do you balance doing stuff? I would say when you're choosing activities, you want to prioritize things that you like, that you also think that will help you, that will I don't want to say make you look good because it's kind of superficial, but that you can talk about as part of your story. So for example, I play the piano and I participated in some musical events on campus. We put together a cultural concert of like all South Asian songs and had like a jam in And so that took, and we got a big audience for that, and that took like dozens of hours to prep. But, and even though it's not medically related, that's something that I love and something that I can talk about as part of my story because I love music. I also volunteered as a medical interpreter at a low-cost clinic. That's very cliche for a pre-med student, but I also really, really enjoyed it, and I felt like I could talk about it in a really substantive way. Gap year. Do you recommend taking gap year if you don't have any research clinical experience? I would say, I mean, any of these questions, I would have to like take a look at your overall profile because that's ultimately what you're going to be submitting. So feel free to reach out to us. We are happy to help you with these kinds of questions. How do you stand out when you aren't? Okay, hang on. I'm going to take a couple more of these specific questions and I'm going to move on. When you're musically or athletically talented, I mean, there are other things besides music and athletics that you can love doing. And I think that finding that and being able to talk about it, because it's all about talking about things that you care about to show who you are as a person. That is pretty much what you're doing. And some of those things are going to be medical related, some of them are not. So research projects in COVID times. Yeah, if I had an answer for that, I would love to tell you, but I kind of jumped ship from college right before this all went down. So yeah, I don't know. That's a rough thing to have to deal with. Yeah. I wish I had a good answer for that one. Okay, resources and tips for retake. It honestly depends on what you feel like you could improve on, and how well you know where your areas of difficulty were. Is it content, time, dumb mistakes, a whole section, parts of the section, types of questions? Your retake prep should be really targeted and really intentional. Don't just go over everything again because that's just going to waste your time. Okay. Mental stamina. I would say this is all about practice. That's why I really like the idea of spending doing consistency over intensity. You get practice, you build this up. When you're starting out initially, maybe stand up and walk around or stretch every 10 minutes, then maybe every 20, every 30, you gradually get used to the longer times. I personally also like to skip around questions. That can be a little bit of a dangerous game, but if you get used to it, you can kind of keep your brain from getting too bored or like your eyes from glazing over if you kind of do some questions of different types and kind of skip around a little bit. Okay, sports. I don't think that's necessarily true. I mean, it's very individualized because like I can't really say don't do sports or do sports. It's very much like how much time is it? What else are you doing? Like how invested are you in it? Why are you invested in it? Stuff like that, and that can change the answer. Okay, research project. I'm running out of time a little bit here, but further questions, feel free to email us, and we will. Yeah, Lauren is correct. But yeah, feel free to email us with questions. We will. What we can do is if any of these questions that you have, email us. We will answer them. If they're general questions, we'll answer them and post all the answers. If they're individualized questions, we can help you individually. I only have a couple slides left. Okay, staying motivated. This will vary from person to person, but what I did is don't miss any meals, physical activity, mentally goofing off, social interaction, all that is really important. Keeping in mind what your true purpose or goal is. You want to go into medicine. This exam is, you're not like, your life's goal is not to take this exam. It is to use this exam as one of many pieces that will go together in your ultimate goal. And also talk to someone about what you're dealing with, especially if they're not pre-med, because then they'll be like, because a lot of my pre-med friends are like, you're doing all this cool stuff and you're studying for this exam and you're working really hard, and you get really excited because you might not notice it, but like going into medicine, the entire process is intense, but really interesting. And so that can give you some perspective. Personal strategy for me, I managed to make MCAT review kind of fun because I was a pretty serious quiz bowl player in high school, and I kind of reached back into my brain for that enthusiasm for like getting questions right and like trivia and testing my knowledge and stuff, and that motivated me a lot. Okay, days leading up to the exam. Okay, your final full length should be no later than 7 days before the exam. I would think even before that is better because you need time to recharge. 3 to 7 days before the exam, go back over your F-up list with specific emphasis on the types of mistakes. So I would say better than content is just looking at what types of mistakes you make and then keeping those in mind. Do you miss the word except in questions? Do you get units wrong? Do you miss labels? Do you have trouble with graphs? That's the kind of stuff you can actually kind of repair over a little bit when in the days before the exam. Maybe a little bit of content review on things that are specific. Don't do like a ton of content review the week before the exam. 2 days before the exam, keep reviewing your F-up list. 1 day before, don't do anything related to the MCAT. Maybe even 2 days before too. Don't do anything. Give yourself a complete break. Do whatever you want, but don't go crazy and still sleep well. Okay, stress-induced procrastination. This is common too, but I think there's two things that are really important. So, perspective. I'm not going to say the line because everyone is going to have like war flashbacks from that particular quote. But it's not the end all or be all of your application. Your dream to go into medicine is not going to live or die with this one score. It's important. It's going to be a big part of your application, but it's not going to be your entire life. Second thing is break it down. One thing my dad always says to me whenever I'm stressed about a big task is, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. So stress-induced procrastination usually comes when you've got a big task that you don't want to do. And to fight that, usually what I do is I break down into a series of smaller activities and then give yourself some time to relax and recharge in between. And then you'll gradually take care of bits and pieces of it, and then that will motivate you to keep going. Okay, so that's the end of my materials. So to conclude, I would say if you have, like, I'm going to reiterate, if you have individual questions, email us. We're happy to work with you for any specific questions you have. If you have general questions, email us about those too. We will post those answers as well. The recording will be, the recording will be emailed to you along with another written study guide that some people have made. And so you'll be able to look at that too. You can always email us any questions about this, any issues with pre-med struggles. We're here to help. So, okay, Sim, do you have anything you want to add at the end?
No, I think you covered most of it. Thank you guys so much for coming. We are volunteers and we really appreciate all of the support that you guys give us. So thank you for doing that. Yeah.
We operate primarily on donations. So if any of you are interested in contributing to our work, the funds go toward things like getting members, I don't know if we're paying for I don't know how the UWorld thing works, but we do use it for like maintaining our website and other stuff which associated with operating costs of running our nonprofit. So yeah, like Sim said, thanks for coming. Reach out to us with anything you need, and have a good night.
Yes, I want to thank MCAT 101 for hosting. It's a really comprehensive, and I think it went great. And thank y'all so much.